We had just talked about Michael Porter and how Michael Porter said that things should be done differently, or either we should try and do things differently or to do different things in terms of establishing our activity pattern. But a person that had taken a different approach was Jack Welch. And if you don't know who Jack Welch is, between 1980 and 2000, he ran General Electric. And he's generally recognized as the most impressive and most important business executive of the latter part of the 20th century. And Jack's principle of operations was always to be number one or number two in every segment of the industry he was in. And of course, General Electric is made up of hundreds of different companies. So he would evaluate those companies, and if they were not number one or number two in their respective fields, he would jettison that company. And his thinking was that they want to be able to use their resources in the most effective way. And the leader in any industries is the one who's going to be using their resources the most effectively. And anyone who's in second, third, or fourth position is, by definition, unable to be as effective as the leader. So he wanted to avoid that. The other thing that he's known for is General Electric always would evaluate their people, their managers every year, and the bottom 10% was always let go. Well, Porter disagrees with this aspect, not necessarily about jettisoning the people at the bottom of the performance level, but he disagrees with the idea of trying to be number one or number two in the industry. And this is because that is competing to be the best. And as we'll see as we go forward a little bit, this is a zero-sum game. That if you want to be the best in the industry, all you're going to do is end up cutting up all of your competitors and getting cut up yourself. What he says that you want to do is to compete to be unique rather than to be the best. So good competitive strategies will result in sustainably superior performance to the extent that they maintain that difference. And frankly, you're going to find that there are very few companies in the, or organizations for that matter, in the United States that effectively do that. You can probably tick them off on the fingers of two hands. People like Procter & Gamble, Southwest Airlines, Disneyland or the Disney organization, Starbucks, IKEA Furniture. Well, there's five, and all of a sudden I'm beginning to get a little bit of a drought and trying to figure out number 6 through 10. There are very, very few companies that over time can sustain the competitive advantage that they build. Now, because Porter's principle is to be unique, what this means is there doesn't have to be just one winner. You can position yourself so that, for example, at our BSG game, everybody can be a winner. And I've had groups that industries in the past where out of a group of 10 different companies competing with one another, 8 of the 10 ended up with superior results because each of them had found a unique position. Well, Porter gives us 3 ideas as how we can compete. He was the first person to really study this, and he came up with 3 different ideas that are generic approaches. Now, there's many different approaches to strategy to be unique, but these 3 work out very well. The first one is to be a low-cost provider. The second is to offer differentiated products. And the third is to be a best-cost provider, which is a combination of low costs in operations, but giving a differentiated value to the customer. So these can be tweaked in a variety of different ways. But as we're trying to make a selection as to what approach to take, one thing you want to remember, and this is counterintuitive, and on this slide you're going to see a little star up in the corner, and anytime you see a star on one of my slides, this is something that's important. In order to be effective and make the best bottom line profit, we have to give the lowest acceptable quality and performance in our product that the customers want to receive. And this goes against most everything we think about in marketing, where we're always thinking about giving more and more to the customer. But the reality is, customers don't want to pay for things they don't need. So anytime we have to add anything to a product, we want to make sure it's something that the customer is willing to pay for. If they aren't willing to pay for it, we want to skinny that product down and make sure that the features and benefits that are offered to the customers are exactly what the customer wants, nothing more. Recognize it as your so when you're doing your product here, you do want to skinny it down, and we'll talk a little bit about how to do that in the next couple of slides. But during the game, recognize that as you reduce your prices, volume will increase. And because of the way overhead works in this game, the closer you can come to full capacity, the lower your overall cost will be. So, for example, if you find out that your company runs with $1 million overhead, and that's the costs that go on irrespective of whether you're running or not. If you were running $1 million worth of overhead and you had a capacity of 1 million pairs of shoes, and we're only selling 100,000 pairs of shoes, you would end up with $10 worth of overhead for every pair sold. By contrast, if you could drive your volume up to close to that 1 million pairs, your overhead would only run $1, a difference of $9 purely related to the amount of volume you put through that plant. So it's important that we drive to get the highest volume we can out of our plants. Well, let's take a look at these three different approaches. And the first one is low-cost provider. Now, low-cost provider doesn't mean just cutting price. It means coming up with meaningful permanent cost reductions as well. Price cuts have to be matched with cost cuts because we want to maintain our margins. Some specifics of how this can be done, and Porter talks about two different approaches, and I'm going to highlight here some things that can be used in the game for each of those approaches. The first one is to control the cost drivers by doing things differently. And in the game, one of the things that you can do is take advantage of scale economies. And this is just what I described previously, where if you drive more shoes through the plant, you end up with a lower, you get the advantage of the scale economy and reduce the amount of cost allocated per shoe. And you'll notice on this slide that I have, and you'll see this on the next several slides, I have an asterisk by some of the elements on that slide. In this case, everyone has an asterisk by it. And what that indicates is the thing I'm describing is applicable to the game. If there's no asterisk, this is something that's applicable to implementing that strategy, but not necessarily applicable to the game. So by increasing your volume, what you do is, of course, get the advantage of the scale economies of better capacity utilization, better spread of your R&D and advertising over a larger number of pairs sold. The second thing that you can do is take advantage of the experience curve. And this is something that's been studied for at least the last 40 years and across a whole broad spectrum of industries. And it turns out that if volume for the industry doubles, the costs for the products drop by 20 to 30%. And this repeats itself time after time as the volume doubles, the cost curve continues to come down. There are the possibility of using labor-saving methods. And in the game, you have the ability to increase wages, which ironically may reduce labor cost, because it turns out that as you give 25 to 50 cents more to a worker per hour, you tend to bring out a much better class of worker every time you increase those wages. So if you are operating strictly at minimum wage, there is one class of worker that you'll get. Kick it up 50 cents and you're going to get an entirely different workforce that may be more productive in terms of cost per unit produced than if you had the lower price labor. A second thing that you can do is experience training. You can do that within the game. And then you can do what's called best practices, and we'll look at that a little bit later. Another area where you can be different is in terms of supply chain efficiency. And as this specifically relates to the game, you have the opportunity to build your product in one of your two factories, one factory in North America and the other one in Asia, and ship in your local market or ship overseas. Now you can run into some unusual situations. Obviously there's cost involved in shipping product overseas. There's also a time lag. And so you, as part of your supply chain efficiency, you have to consider the cost of shipping in a faster fashion, perhaps by air as opposed to going on a slow boat from China. As you reduce the amount of time that the product is in transit, the price of that goes up. The cost of that will go up. However, it makes a much happier dealer because dealers want to have product on their shelf and not in the pipeline. Correspondingly, another thing that figures into the supply chain efficiency, if you are shipping into certain areas, you're going to be incurring duties. Now, here's a possible strategy. You might make your product in Asia and you could deliver it directly to Latin America. That's a place where you do only distribution and don't have a factory. However, in shipping that to Latin America, you're going to pick up duty. What you might choose to do is to ship product manufactured in Asia to the North America and then have the North American factory produce product in North America but ship to Latin America where there's no duty. And this end around, going from one country to another producing country and then moving that from that producing company to a duty-free area may end up with a cheaper product. But this is a way to do things differently. Finally, you have the option in the game of using high-cost or high-value raw materials or low-value raw materials. Now, you can make a very high-quality shoe with low-cost materials, but you can also enhance the quality of your product by going with the high cost. What you have to do is figure out where you want to be with that, because if everyone decides they want to use low-cost materials, the price on the high-cost materials will come down. The man manufacturing those high-cost materials has to keep operating, so he's going to cut his costs to allow him to keep his factory full. So correspondingly, if everyone buys the high-cost materials, the cost for low-priced materials is going to drop even further, and the price for the high-cost materials will go up. So it's just a straight supply and demand activity. Now, the second approach that we can take is to bypass cost-producing activities that customers don't want to pay for, and this is doing different things. And with respect to the game, one of the things that you can do is direct end-user sales. Your internet sales can be a significant part of your strategy, and that eliminates the cost for the customer of having to go to a store to do his shopping, and also potentially saves him on cost versus what he might pay at the retail level. However, recognize that if you're selling in both the retail market, that is you're wholesaling it to retailers who then sell it to the public, you must have a price differential for your internet sales that will still allow that dealer to mark up your product and make a fair profit. So if, for example, you sold a product to the dealer for $40 and he was going to retail it for $70, if you sold your internet sale at $50, where you're getting $10 more per unit sold than you would get from the retailer can't make a fair profit, and he's going to drop you. On the other hand, if you offered your price at $68 or $69, which takes a little bit of margin from the retail dealer, he's still probably going to be okay because he recognizes some people like the convenience of ordering over the internet, and there are other people that are willing to pay more to come into a store because they like the idea of being able to sample different products and have the joy or the fun of going on a shopping expedition. So consider that as you are doing your direct to end user sales. A second thing is you can relocate closer to customers. And of course, one of the things you'll be able to do in this game as your volume increases, you may want to establish a factory in either Europe, Africa, or in Latin America to pick up on the demand that's down there. And customers will obviously, that is the dealers, will obviously prefer to buy from something that's local because, again, they get quicker response. So this is one of the options that you have. Now, no frills product or service is another attribute, but this is not something that you can really accomplish with the game. Finally, another thing that you can do is look at limited versus full line production. And in your case, you have the ability to sell between 50 model styles and 500 model styles. And a model style is a combination of the size of the shoe and the styling of the shoe. So if we were to have sizes between a 6 and a 12 and half sizes, that turns out to be 13 model style combinations for what essentially is a single shoe. And so 4 times 13 is 52. That's not a whole lot of breadth of product line. Even if you go out to 500, it's still not a real large breadth of product line. But recognize that your customers would prefer you to have a broad product line because this gives them more things to sell. And their attitude is, look, if you can get them, I can get them into the store. I just have to have a lot of choices for them, and they'll walk out with a pair of shoes of one sort or another. Give me some options to present to them. On the other hand, your production department is going to want the least amount of model styles possible, because every change in model style represents a new setup on their machinery. It also means that and setups cost time, but it also costs you because you end up with some extra parts left over that were not part of that last production run. Or you'll have some startup losses because it takes a while to line your equipment out. So there'll be a constant dynamic as you attempt to go with either a limited or a full line product line. Constant dynamic between marketing that wants the greatest number of possibilities and operations that wants the fewest number of possibilities for model styles. Now remember that low-cost leadership means low overall costs. It's not just manufacturing cost or production costs, and it definitely does not mean giving unsustainable discounts. So also one other thing that you must recognize when you're going in with a low-cost, low-price approach, you have to continue to invest all the things that you need in a good marketing campaign. And that means you still have to pay a lot for advertising, you have to still get celebrity endorsements, and you have to offer dealer incentives. You can't cut these back just because you've reduced your costs. There's a tendency to think that what we need to do with a low-cost, low-price approach is to really go on a starvation diet for the company. And that definitely is not the case. You have to support all the aspects, but you have to find ways to just be more efficient in doing that. And what you're trying to do is to, and you can do this over time, is to create differences in the way the combination you use in your marketing approach, for example, in your breadth of product line and in your pricing that are difficult for the customers, for your competitors to match. Now, you're going to be saving some money when you go with a low-cost, low-price approach. And the question is, what do we do with those savings? And there's 2 alternatives you have. On the one hand, you can say, leave the price the same. We'll take all of the cost savings that we've generated and put them in that place in the back of our hand and stick it in our pocket. It's just additional profit. But recognize if you do that, the customers seem to have a way of finding out when your costs have gone down, and they expect to do some cost sharing with you. So if you don't give them part of that savings, what will happen is they'll go to the competitors, and the competitors will come in because there's a higher margin now available because they can cut their costs as well. And they'll take some of the market share away from you. The other thing that you can do is pass on all of those costs or the majority of those costs to the consumers. And this will give you, of course, an edge in the market, but it also discourages competition from coming in because they won't have an opportunity to steal a lot of extra margin. Where will this low cost, low price work best? First of all, if you have a homogeneous product, if people can't tell the difference, they can go up to the corner where there's 4 service stations on the corner, and they can make a decision to buy their gas just based on what it says on the sign as the price. And it's just easy to make a U-turn to catch a lower price. So a homogeneous product does have to have low cost, low price, because people can move from one supplier to another. If price competition is vigorous, this is another area where you have to have the low cost so you can hunker down if there is a price war going on. If you've got a standard product that is supplied by many suppliers, the customers will have a tendency to try and whipsaw you and get the lowest possible price for the vendor that'll bend over the farthest for them. If the buyers all use the product in the same way, it's more difficult to differentiate or to create a value in the customer's mind when everyone's using the same products the same way. Now, on the slide that should be before you, there's 3 items here that have in parentheses 5F. And these represent what Porter calls the 5 forces. And we'll have an opportunity to take a look at that, but these are the forces that work in the marketplace to make it more difficult to make a buck. And 3 of those that appear in low cost, low price are, number 1, low switching costs, which is what I just described, where you can make a U-turn and get a lower cost with no real penalty for switching, other than waiting for the traffic light to change so you can make that U-turn. Secondly, where there are buyers who have large and significant, your buyers are large and they have significant buying power. For example, if you wanted to do business with Walmart, which you may well do with the private label product, they have a large influence on pricing, and it is very important to be a low-cost producer for that marketplace. And then thirdly, if you have a situation where people want to move into the market, if you did, for example, open a factory in Latin America and try and garner a significant portion of that market, you may find that one of your competitors might try and horn in on that market by cutting their price and buying market share, and trying to enter into that market. And you've got to be in a position to keep your costs low enough that you can hunker down and absorb those price gouging or price reductions that would come about as a new player tries to enter your market. So let's break and we'll come back with the next element.